Hey, so thanks for sending along the data logs and sending you an email about the other two with the third gear poles. But wanted to just take a moment. Think it'd be easier to share with you through the video about the throttle response data log that you took, and we can look and see what's going on there with your accel enrichment. So just looking at this data log here, it's a short one. We're looking at right now throttle position, which is our kind of a grayish white line. We can see where we get a little bit of a throttle increase right there, and our RPMs on the green line. So we're going to add some things to this. Let's go ahead and throw in some fuel information. So let's look at our AFR target, and let's look at our actual AFR. So we'll just throw in a couple more things here to add to the mix. So first of all, we're seeing that prior to getting into it here, we see that our throttle position's at 0. We're idling at about 1600 or so RPM. Notice too that back here before the throttle blip that you do here, our AFRs are already riding about 18 or so. So we're kind of lean already before, from the beginning of this log until we get down here to the point where we are blipping on the throttle. And we're going to see some changes that are going to happen here. So as we get ready to look at that, let's add one more piece of data. Let's look at our engine load or vacuum, which is going to be down here as PSI from KPA. All right, so now we've got a few pieces of information we can look at. So as we're getting into this blip of the throttle here, we'll notice that we're already lean, as we talked about, and our target is going to drop down a little bit, as it should, about 13.5, as our engine load went from a vacuum of minus 11 PSI right up to about right there on the threshold of 0 PSI. Next thing we're seeing here, though, is we're seeing that our AFR is really dropping down dramatically as we go down this line here. It's going to bottom out really at about 8.5. So essentially here, and then it's going to start to clean itself up a little bit afterward, but we're going to find out why we went from being lean, or wherever we may have started off as, and then going dramatically rich. So it's going to add a few more things here, and we're going to see what's happening. All right, so next we're going to add in some of our transient throttle data that we collected in the data log and see how it's impacting the AFR that we're getting in the response or lack of response that is showing up. So let's add in a couple things here. First, we're going to add in the transient throttle load derivative. And let's add in the transient throttle enrichment rate. And finally, we'll add in the transient throttle fuel enrichment sink amount. That's the important part here. Okay, so we've got those three. There's a couple corrections that we might as well throw in to look at as well. We've got a transient throttle coolant temp fuel correction. And there's also a little bit of an ignition correction we added in, which won't have too much of a bearing here, but it's something we can look at. Since we're talking about coolant, let's get the coolant temperature as well onto the screen. All right, so now we got all the data that we need to look at to understand what's going on. All right, so we're going to zoom in here and make things a little bit more granular as we go through this transition. So points to look at here is, number one, the transient throttle enrichment load derivative is 200, and the transient throttle enrichment starting load is 0. And that's going to give us a transient throttle fuel enrichment rate of 80. Where does this all come from? This comes from this table right here, which is sort of it's the enrichment rate table. This is a table that we don't really change unless absolutely necessary. This is kind of like the base amounts here. So we knew that our starting load was 0 and our load derivative was 200, and that gave us this number right here of 80. So that's kind of like our starting transitional throttle enrichment rate. Right, and from there we can switch back over to our Megalog viewer, and we'll notice that the next thing here is our transient throttle fuel enrichment sink amount is 214.3. And this is the key, I think, with all that's happening here. So we switch back over and look and see where this transient throttle fuel enrichment sink amount comes from. It comes from the enrich amount sink table. And here we knew our RPMs were, let's flip back here and see our RPMs were about 947. RPMs of 947, and our PSI we knew to be at about minus 10 or 11. So with 947 on the RPMs and minus 10 to 11 psi, that's going to bring us right down here, somewhere between 750 and 1,000, closer to 1,000. And that's the lowest that we're going to get is minus 6.9 here on this. So that's going to bring us somewhere between the 210 and 230. This is our transient throttle fuel enrichment sink amount. This is the amount of extra fuel that's being added as we're trying to get some response off the line here. So that 210 to 230 actually at the end of the day results in, for us, an amount of 214. As I mentioned, there's a couple of correctional tables that go in here. There's a throttle, transient throttle coolant temperature fuel correction. So our coolant temperature was 78.4 degrees, and so based on that, we've got a little bit of 1.3% adder, or 1.3% added to the fuel. And we also added a little bit of ignition timing of about 4.2 degrees here to kind of get us jump started. So overall, what I believe is happening here is that this 214.3 is just way too much fuel. So although it starts off when you feel that we are lean, we're already lean, so we can figure that out. But what happens, and it happens very quickly, that this throttle response is so quick that the AFR gauge doesn't even really pick up on it until it's almost over. So here's our throttle event here. We kind of get toward our map positioning in around the end of vacuum. But then we have this huge dive down. AFR sink all the way from 17.8 down to flat line and stay there for a while. I think that is all because of this entire amount of enrichment is too much. So we're going to roll this back. I'll take a lot of that enrichment out, and we're going to give it a shot with that and see how these numbers translate and see if our AFR start to pick up there. If the AFR start to get more in line with our target, I believe that we won't be bogging down. We'll be able to get the start off the line that you're looking for. So what we'll do is we'll go in here and we'll take off 50% of this. And we just kind of blend it on back in the rest of the way down here. See how that works out for us. All right, give it a shot.